and then talk a little bit about what you can expect from tonight. We would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land of which we are in Colorado is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to these lands and the water that make up the state of Colorado, and that these sacred lands and water have been violated and polluted. We honor the elders, past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that government, academic, and cultural institutions were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous people. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of oppression and inequities and recognize the current and future contributions of Indigenous communities throughout the region. I would also like to start. So, thanks for taking the time to be here, everyone. I want to acknowledge all the groups who have been taking part in trying to put these together. We have people from Green Latinos and University of Colorado Boulder and CSU and Frac Tracker presenting, and Sierra Club, but we also have 350 Colorado and Halt the Harm and Citizens for a Healthy Community and Cultivando and Be the Change, and all sorts of people getting together trying to think about Colorado, the Colorado water crisis, and the role that oil and gas plays in it. So if you're tuning in tonight, you're hearing the first of 3 webinars. We're going to get the big picture tonight. We're going to talk to experts. We're going to hear data, researchers, all of it, to kind of get a sense of where we are in this space. If you join us in a week from today, we'll hear from the people impacted by those policies, by the scarcity of water, by the contamination in the water throughout the state. We'll hear from people on the Western Slope, in Commerce City, in Northern Colorado. So we'll hear the real life impacts of all this data and policy that we're talking about tonight. And in the third webinar that we'll have in 2 weeks from today, we'll talk about what kind of action we can take. What are the solutions to this problem, and how can we all work together? So without taking up any more of your time, I want to introduce Ian Tafoya. He is the Colorado Director for Green Latinos and the National River Hero Award winner. And he's going to give us kind of the big picture overview of what the state of Colorado's water is. So thanks so much, Ian. Take it away.
Thanks, Kate. Appreciate that. And bienvenidos a todos. My name is Ian Thomas Tafoya. I am the Colorado State Director for Green Latinos. Green Latinos is a national environmental justice and conservation equity organization that works all across the country. And 3 years ago, yesterday, we came here to Colorado as our first state-based program. And we've had a lot of success here, and I'm pleased to announce that we're going to Texas next. And, in my 3 years that I've been with Green Latinos, I've had the opportunity to travel I have one more trip, and I'll be to all 64 counties in Colorado. And so in that time, we've met with thousands of Coloradans who talked to us about a whole host of issues: energy, air quality, water quantity, so many huge pieces to this. And I'm just really was honored that I was selected today to be able to just kind of give an overview of some of the things that I've learned over this time. And as you heard, I did win a River Hero Award from the River Network last year. I was one of 6 people picked in the United States for some of the work that I was doing, not only for Green Latinos, but also with a nonprofit that I helped founded as a mutual aid group called Headwaters Protectors, that was really framed around ensuring water access and sanitation access to the most vulnerable and unhoused in our communities. And I think that's the place that I'd like to just start with talking to you about our state of water. No matter where I go in Colorado, what I hear are people are concerned about housing, that there's not enough housing, and homelessness is on the rise across America and certainly here in Colorado. I had an opportunity to visit an encampment when I was in Durango. I've seen them in Glenwood Springs, and they certainly are prevalent here in Denver, where I am from. And so, from a water equity and access, I just really want you to think about what it would be like for you if you didn't have access to stable housing, and where would you access sanitation, and where would you access water. It's unfortunate these things aren't coordinated in our society. And so I really just want to start with that the homelessness and water access is a huge issue for everybody. And it's something that the Headwaters Protectors, you can check out on Instagram. You can see the work that we do. During the pandemic, businesses were closed, libraries were closed, rec centers were closed, and we have water fountains that haven't been functioning due to maintenance issues across Colorado for a long period of time. And so it's an issue that I would invite everyone to contact their local city councils, their local mayors or county commissioners to be having conversations about, because it's something that's incredibly important. Now, Kate, I really appreciate your land acknowledgement. And why is it that so many tribes called Colorado home? Because we're the headwater state, y'all. We have a deep responsibility to protect the water like my ancestors did. And so my ancestors are Hickory, Apache, and Okewinge from the headwaters of the Rio Grande. Part of the work that I've been doing with Green Latinos that was recognized for the National River Hero Award was talking about the Rio Grande Basin and the impacts to oil and gas, impacts from a climate crisis, and the migration that is occurring, the lack of water access for farmers who have been divested of their property by colonialism, right? Those early water rights were not granted. There have been some successes. Let me take the San Luis Valley, where a recent case was settled with the Sequia Institute, where people got access back to their water rights for agricultural resources. But it's a huge place to start when we talk about water quantity. This push and pull between the needs of tourism, talk about skiing, the needs of communities that are growing here in the Front Range, and the needs to produce agricultural goods, which play a huge part in our overall economy here in Colorado. And then, of course, there's the rights of nature. There are so many groups that I have met and encountered across Colorado that are working to increase stream flows for the health of the animals. Some of the things you need to think about with these low river flows and temperature, as the temperature goes up because there's less water in the river, the peak of the flow comes at a different time. And if there's less water in the river, if there are toxics in the river, they're actually at a higher concentration. And one of the things that I've always been taught when this comes to water quality is that dilution is the solution. So more water in the streams is better. More water in the systems that isn't contaminated helps make the water safer for everybody. But I'm sure I'm not alone in seeing the fire crisis that is upon us here in the West. From California to New Mexico to Colorado, we have seen devastating fires. And why is it? Because we're in drought. And now, if you're not aware of this, NASA, whom we trust to send our people to space, who invented Velcro and all these other amazing goods that we use in our society, is predicting a multi-decade mega drought, with Colorado in the bullseye if we don't change our ways when it comes to climate crisis. I have seen that this drought, the current drought, is the lowest amount of water we've had since the medieval times, since 850 AD. Well, guess what? My ancestors abandoned Mesa Verde in 850 AD. This is a contemporary time where we saw massive migrations of people. And if you're not aware, this drought is impacting places like Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala. And the people that we've seen come here in the 90s from Chihuahua, Durango, it's happening now again. And so climate migration and the lack of housing for those people as well is a huge issue that I just want to bring awareness to. Now, when it comes to quantity, we're always running into this issues about the larger cities like Denver and the Front Range, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, taking water from the Western Slope. And we know that we're in these complex systems of treaties, basically water compacts that we have to honor, that we haven't been honoring in some cases. There's constantly debates about that going on. I'm sure people may have heard recently that Nebraska is asking to build some more canals so that they can store more water. The water plan is being updated today, or this time, right, this year. And I know that you're going to hear more about that as these go on, but I want you to be thinking about that, about how do we balance the farmers? How do we balance the cities? Are we going to continue growing turf? Are we going to get smart about recycling our water? These are all big issues that I think people are talking a lot about. And another one from an environmental justice standpoint that was brought up to me recently. So I've been on a statewide Take on Toxics tour where we've been talking to people about what their issues are and relating them to pieces of legislations that are moving. In April, we went to 16 cities, and we are certain that this issue that's going on with the San Luis Valley, where there's conversation about water being brought up to these mostly white suburbs that are growing grass, is a water justice and a water equity conversation. These are the oldest water rights in the state of Colorado. And to see them on the chopping block, this has been talked about for 30 years, is just an issue that I want you to think about. I'm going to switch to talk a little bit about water quality and just how important it is, I think, for us to be taking on water quality. It directly relates to wastewater and toxics that are left over from industry. And one of the things that's important to know, and we've had this conversation with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, is that we do not have updated water standards. It has been decades since we've had these conversations about upgrading protections on our rivers. So even when I have conversations with rural water boards and they say, look, we're following everything that we're supposed to, yet the water has a color that doesn't make it palatable. It has a smell that doesn't make it palatable. Yes, it's legal under the standards that people are being held to, but we need to fight to improve those. You know, we're doing that currently at the legislature for air toxics. We're fighting to get more protections for more chemicals. I think it's time for us to start thinking about how do we upgrade protections on these water standards. And I hope that you join Green Latinos and our many partners as we embark upon that journey. It became even more clear to us that that was an important conversation as we were doing paid focus groups and focusing on events with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment on recycled water. If you're not familiar with what recycled water is, it's the idea that you can use this water over and over again, take it from the wastewater stream, purify it, and put it back into the system. It's something that's high on people's list of conversation because we have this drought that everyone's experiencing. And communities like Aurora and Castle Rock are some of the first communities that are talking about it. They're actually working through a rulemaking, and after I'm done speaking, I'll drop that link in and a link to a bilingual webinar that we hosted with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment about how do we ensure if communities do make the decision to reuse their water, that it's safe for everyone to drink. But it was in that conversation that the state openly admitted to us that these water standards were woefully lacking, that there needs to be upgrades to it, and they showed us a pathway forward. There's another bill that's moving at the Capitol right now, and that's about lead in your water. There's lead service lines that are in many cities for homes that were built more than 50 years ago. And there are federal resources that are moving down. Here in Denver, they said it was going to take nearly 50 years to upgrade. We worked with Representative Diana DeGette's office to get that down to 15 years. And there actually are some really amazing resources. I'll drop a link to a list of database resources that we use to help educate communities to determine where lead risk is in their communities. And there is a bill that's moving at the Capitol right now. I just got word that it's moving out of appropriations and has a good chance of passing this year. That would ensure that lead testing occurs in all child care facilities and schools in Colorado, and that if there is lead to be found in the water, that they have 90 days to not only shut down that water use, but upgrade it with filters. Now, we were looking to get filters into every school and every child care center. We thought that was the precautionary principle. It's unfortunate that those resources we're not fully committed to that. And so it's going to be testing first, then filters. But we were really hoping to take the precautionary principle in that case. Another important thing to know about is PFAS. And I know you're going to hear about that later. And I think it's really disconcerting that ProPublica recently released a report that let us know that it's possible we have the most PFAS contamination in the entire country. As a headwater state, it means we have an even more of a responsibility to take it on because downstream water, if we can't keep it clean and we're the first users, that's a problem. And so we have to take it on. There is a bill that was moving through the Capitol as well that would ban it in many, many products. Perhaps you've heard of it. Teflon is a very common one. It's also been used in firefighting foams. I don't want to steal the thunder, though, knowing that PFAS is going to be talked about later, but I just really wanted to set that topic up for everybody. Now, oil and gas, Absolutely. It's consuming tons of fresh water. It is also being pumped underground, which is taking it out of the water cycle. And in some cases, it's being spread out on the land, which only, of course, may lead to more contamination in the riverways. It is very concerning, and Green Latinos has worked with the University of Colorado Public Health to do an analysis on what we can do to talk about water rates, which we learned in Weld County. People are actually paying less to use it for fracking than a person is using it to drink. And then there's the conversation about the fees that they pay to make this water toxic. I'm going to be presenting in the third week, having a conversation about that, but I wanted to put that on your radar. We're also releasing a report here in a couple weeks that is an analysis of North Denver, where we have started taking a look at more than 1,000 businesses that perhaps that are contributing to the cumulative water pollution in North Denver. You know, we're searching for resources to do this for Pueblo. We're searching for resources to do this in Grand Junction. There are many other cities that have these roughly inland ports is a really good way to describe it. It's not technically a port because the goods aren't traveling through from out of state and need to be logged by the federal government, but they're logistics centers that are contributing. And what we found was there were more than 100 clean water violations across these businesses in the last 3 years alone. And so we are working diligently with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment for accountability, with the Environmental Protection Agency, Region 8, to have a conversation about enforcement and compliance. And if you haven't heard, they've actually opened an investigation into the error division around Title VI. And we do believe that there also are issues with the water division that need to be addressed. They've also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to increase enforcement in disproportionately impacted communities. But all of these things require more people paying attention. And so I hope that today and the next 3 webinars, you feeling empowered and understanding that there are many issues without a doubt, and it could be really overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. You could join with one of our groups and take action, because together we rise, together we do the work, and we have had success. And I'm going to switch to telling you just one thing about success, and then I'll pass it off to the next people. But we have partnered with other environmental groups and community groups to bring the first of its kind community-based rulemaking to upgrade protections on the South Platte River. We are moving through the process, and we'll have a hearing in September, but it is something that I think is really empowering. And when you go to school, they teach you about 3 branches of government. They don't teach you about the 4th. That's you and me and our ability to do the work to collect petitions. We wouldn't have had the advancement had we not gone out there and fought for 112. We wouldn't have had these advancements if we wouldn't have fought for protections in the local level. And I have now begun to learn the rules. And I understand that we can challenge for our own rulemakings at the Air Quality Control Commission, the Air Quality Control, Water Quality, the Public Utilities Commission. These are tools that we haven't fully tapped into understanding how we can use. And I think the last thing I'd like to close with is about the Environmental Justice Action Task Force. And I want to tell you a story about people doing the work. This time last year, our Governor Polis, threatened to veto the Environmental Justice Act. And so the Sunrise Movement and Green Latinos went to Boulder and put 8,000 flyers into his own neighborhood. And we told him we'd be back in 2 weeks. We traveled to 11 cities, and we came back and we marched on his house with his own councilman, his own commissioner, his own state representative, and we passed the act in the final hours of the last day of legislature nearly a year ago. And it's created this Environmental Justice Action Task Force. And I was appointed by the Speaker of the House and elected by that body to be the co-chair, leading our way of reforming more than 10 agencies: the Colorado Department of Agriculture, the Public Utilities Commission, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, Department of Natural Resources. I'm sure that many people on these calls have been involved over the years in fighting for justice in one of these agencies. We need your experience now. We need you to come forward between now and November to bring forward your best policy ideas to show us where the system has been broken. You can go to CDPHE and Environmental Justice, or Justicia Ambiental, and we have websites that are one-stop landing pages where you can find the events that are happening in your community that are related to environmental justice. You can also submit your comments online, or you can attend an event in person. But I am very confident that we have a real opportunity here to do good. We do have industry people that are on this committee. That's often how these blue ribbon commissions are created. But we have won some of their votes. I was personally elected 17 out of 20 votes, which means that we have the faith that we can go forward, but we need your voice. And I think what you're going to hear today, again, is a huge opportunity to find your niche, to find the place that you want to get involved. And if you have any questions, if you've never testified before, if you don't know how to do the work or where to start, Kate is here. I am here. There are people who are here to be your guides, to help you self-actualize in your movement, because it's easy right now to be paralyzed by the fear. It's easy to be paralyzed by the massive amount of work that needs to be done, but there is strength in numbers, and we've shown you what happens when we stand up. And this year, we are standing up. This same tour, this Take on Toxics tour, we actually may pass all 9 of the bills that we have been fighting for, to get lead out of our water, to fight for air toxics to be out of our air, to ban PFAS and fracking fluid and disclose what it is. These are powerful bills that you can get involved in. And if you're wondering what you can do between now and May 11th, it's to get on the phone, it's to send an email to your legislator to tell them it's time to take on toxics. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you so much, Ian. Really appreciate it. We're going to hear some heavy stuff, so it's great to start on a note of empowerment, and I really appreciate that. I am going to try and model, because I like to speak very quickly, to have people pause between their thoughts for the people in the interpretation room, because I think it takes 20% longer to say things in Spanish than it does in English. So with that, I'm gonna try to do that. I would like to introduce Kyle Farrar. He is the Western Program Coordinator for FracTracker Alliance, and he is going to talk to us about what happens to water. Like Ian gave us this great overview, and now we're going to get into different kind of segments of it. We're going to talk about what happens to water in the water cycle in fracking. So take it away, Kyle. Kyle, are you here? Oh, I see you. I see that you're here, but I can't hear you. Anybody else hear Kyle? Oh, hold on. I also had my
Hello,
dog.
can you hear me? There we are.
Oh,
Okay,
there you
sorry.
are. Okay, thanks, Kyle.
Hey.
It looks like a ghost came to my
Testing.
house. It was my dog coming in to
Ah,
visit me. Oh, okay. Whoop, there we go. Thanks, Kyle.
there we are. It worked the first time. I don't know why it didn't work the second time. Kate, are you able to pull up the PowerPoint presentation that I emailed to you? Is
Oh,
that
yeah, I can
possible?
do that unless you want to share it. Do you want me to share it?
Yeah, could you share it?
I
Since
can.
I
Give
have
me
my
1
notes
second
and this.
to find it. So you go ahead and get started, and I will pull it up in just a second. Sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you. Maybe you want to lock your screen so people aren't just.
Hey,
Very
I've
good.
got it right here. Do you want me to?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Ryan. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
No problem.
Yeah, I've been on PTO for taking care of some personal matters and family issues for the past 2 weeks. So it will really help to have this presentation in front of me. Thank you so much. So I work for a group called FracTracker Alliance. Our website is fractracker.org. We are a nonprofit that is focused on data transparency and translating data into information so that community groups and grassroots groups can utilize it for their policy goals. So if you are thinking about a way that data could support your work, please feel free to reach out. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? Wonderful. So I'm going to talk about the inputs of water resources and the outputs of wastes within the greater extraction system that's necessary to facilitate the use of hydraulic fracturing in Colorado. So here we have a diagram from the EPA, and it shows the water cycle stages of hydraulic fracturing. Those stages start with water acquisition. Next is chemical mixing, and that's a process that happens prior to the fracking process, which, if you hear industry say it, specifically refers to the stimulation of the source rock, the breaking up of the shale. So the frack water is injected, breaks up the shale, and then flows back to the surface along with formation brines. And that wastewater will continue to flow to the surface for the life of the well. Thank you, Julie. So this is all the wastewater that either is recycled for use in future fracking operations or other industrial processes, or most likely it is disposed. And I will talk more about those disposal methods a little later in the presentation. So I'm going to begin, as the overview says, talking about the water volumes and water sources, and then get into the wastewater, and then the disposal, and then future research. Next slide, please. So for this presentation, I summarized water use and wastewater production data for Colorado. These summaries right here describe water that is used for fracking. This data is sourced from FracFocus and not from the COGCC, which is the Colorado regulatory body. So there may be volumes that are missed. Also, the COGCC does not track water consumption volumes or sources, unfortunately, which they should. Because so far this year, about 2.3 billion gallons of fresh water have been used for fracking in Colorado. Now, the oil and gas industry will tout this as a very small percentage compared to the agricultural industry. But unlike the agricultural industry, fracking and the oil and gas industry removes this water from the water cycle, whereas agriculture usually puts it back into the ground. And I'll talk more about this a little later. So from these tables, we can see that over half of the volume has been consumed in Weld County by Noble Energy, Crestone, Anadarko, and Extraction, together using over 250 million gallons of fresh water. And particularly interesting in these charts is the company Noble Energy, because their water use per well is so much higher than the rest. It's actually 1/3 higher than the second rank. And that's in the top table right there at average per well, which is pretty interesting. And can we go to the next slide? So for a spatial reference of where operators like Noble are drilling and fracking wells, here's a table of well counts by county for the different operators. Why Noble is using such a high volume per well is a mystery for the most part, but it could be their access to water. So in 2017, Noble split off a subset of their company as a freshwater delivery system that provides fresh water via pipeline across Weld County. So this is the type of data that we look at and will provide insight into bad actors who are overusing water resources, things of that nature. Next slide, please. So this slide talks a bit about where the water is coming from. So Colorado oil and gas operators have been talking about recycling as the future for over 10 years now. but they haven't put it into practice, particularly for sourcing water that they use to frack. So some larger operators are able to reuse a bit of the frack water, such as Anadarko, which reuses about 25% of their frack water for other uses, such as cooling at processing sites. But today, very little wastewater in Colorado is treated and reused. Most is used once for one frack job and then injected into a disposal well. This is the cheapest and therefore most popular option for disposal. In places where disposal wells are not available, like Pennsylvania, reuse and recycling is much more common. And this slide talks about water farming and other sources where operators get their water. And it really comes down to the fact that the vast majority of water used for fracking comes from our groundwater aquifers, as well as municipal surface water withdrawals. And that's one of the several reasons why oil and gas companies, the operators, are actually moving closer and closer to communities to get access to this drinking water that they use for fracking. Next slide, please. So I generated this table from COGCC's production data, and it's downloadable from the link that's on the page here, as well as a link to a report that I put together talking about all of this. I'm sure we can share around this presentation so people can have access to that. So the production data reports accounts of all volumes of flowback and produced water that's coming out of the well after the frack job. They also report the volumes that are reinjected back into the ground in what are called class 2 injection wells. Unfortunately, there's some data discrepancies, so I'm still working on cleaning this data up. But the data shows that the vast majority of fracking flowback and produced waters are disposed of by injection wells back into the ground where they are locked away forever. The data analysis here reports that over 266 million gallons were injected in 2021. And this is 94% of the wastewater produced. Next slide, please. So this is a map I created that shows the locations of the different options for storage and disposal of wastewater, including class 2 injection wells, industrial waste management facilities, and open air pits. In Colorado, waste are managed several ways. If it's not recycled, it can either go to a commercial facility that treats and discharges the wastewater to surface water, but that is expensive and there are not many facilities that are able to do it. The majority of water is injected in class 2 injection wells. Or the third option is to store it in pits, which are of limited volume, or apply it to the land and at centralized facilities that amend it into the topsoil, which pretty much eliminates the use of those soils for agriculture, growing, and puts the groundwater resources underneath those areas at risk of contamination as the wastes percolate through the soil. Next slide, please. Here's a map of disposal wells that I identified that are outside of formation zones that are producing the oil or outside of exemption zones that are classified by the EPA. Class 2 injection wells that inject the wastewater possibly present the greatest risk to groundwater contamination as one component of the overall fracking and oil and gas extraction process. There's been studies that show structural failures inside injection wells are routine. 1 in 6 injection wells have received well integrity violations, and more than 7,000 injection wells showed signs of well casing failures and leakage. And there are different indicators of high risk, and one of them being wells built and drilled prior to 1981. And Colorado has a large collection of wells drilled, injection wells drilled before 1981. So our own analysis identified 1,070 wells that have been issued in Colorado outside of aquifer exemption zones, specifically in areas with high quality drinking water. And that's what this map is showing, areas that have low TDS, total dissolved solids, overlaid with the injection wells. Next slide, please. We've also done a lot of work mapping out oil spills and produced water spills, as they also pose a threat to groundwater as they percolate through soils. And it's also another output of wastewater. So of note, the percent of produced water spilled has drastically increased so far this year, the volume nearly matching previous years. And that's just through the first quarter. And this map here shows the locations of oil spills and wastewater spills from 2014 through present. Next slide, please. So some of my current work and research that I'm actively working on and will be working on moving forward is to create a mass balance of water inputs and wastewater outputs. That is to understand how much wastewater is going unaccounted for, and also exactly how much is going where. There's a form that tracks this. It's Form 26 of the COGCC, and it tracks the individual disposal facilities. This is going to be a bit of a adventure. It's going to be difficult, but I will keep everyone updated as I move forward. Next slide, please. And if anyone has any questions, they can reach out to my email address here or give me a call. And also, I'm sure I'll be taking calls at the end or taking questions at the end with other participants. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much, Kyle, for putting together all that data. I think we had a couple questions in the chat, if it's okay if we ask you right now. Could you define like what quickly is like flowback versus produced water versus wastewater? And like what might be in each of those?
Absolutely. Yes. When I say wastewater, that includes both flowback and produced water. It is just the overarching term. Flowback is the large volume that is pushed back up a wellbore following the fracking process. The fracking process hyperpressurizes a well to break up the target formation, the shale bedrock. And then it comes out at a very high pressure, and it's a large volume. It includes the fracking chemicals, the biocides, the surfactants, things of that nature. After about 30 days, the volume of water, the rate of the volume of water coming out of the well decreases drastically. And from that point forward, for the lifetime of the well, the wastewater is considered to be produced water. So flowback comes first, produced water is for the rest of the lifetime of the well, and is constituted more by the formation brines, the salts that have been trapped in the ancient seabed that they are fracking to remove the oil or gas.
Thank you, that's super helpful. Oh, I really appreciate it. And if anyone else has questions, they can put them So there's a question here. So is produced water natural water?
Yeah, produced water is natural formation brines. It is what's left of the ancient seas that produced the sedimentary layers that trapped all the carboniferous material that is producing the natural gas and oil underneath the ground.
But it's not something we want to drink.
Oh no, it is, for the most part, the largest source of contamination in the wastewaters that we are the most concerned of. It includes many hydrocarbons because you're pulling oil and gas up, BTEX chemicals, other polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and VOCs, carcinogens, toxic chemicals. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. And if you have more questions for Kyle, we can definitely put them in the chat. I'm sorry we're going a little long, but that's how these things go. Everyone has so much awesome, good information. So I want to introduce our next speaker. Thanks so much, Kyle. Really appreciate you and all the data you've been putting together for us. It's so helpful and important. I want to introduce now Joseph Ryan. He's a professor he's a professor at the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering at CU Boulder, and he's going to talk to us about water quality and the use of water and hydraulic fracturing and how it stresses the system. So thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Kate. I met Kate a bunch of years ago, 5 years ago or so, giving a talk about this kind of stuff at her child's school, and thankfully she remembered, so I get another chance to talk about it here. So I'm going to give you an overview of some of the work we did, how oil and gas development has affected water quality in the state of Colorado. And it was investigated in a big research study that we did that was National Science Foundation funded, that we called air, water, gas. If we had any foresight, we would have called it air, water, gas, oil. But when we wrote the proposal way back when and gave it a name, there actually wasn't much fracking for oil. And that kind of came along a little later and obviously has become quite important. And it's also quite helpful to go after Kyle's presentation. He introduced a lot of the terms. So starting off here, here's a map of, and just make sure, can you see my screen?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, good. This is a map of Colorado, and all the red dots are oil and gas wells. And there was a maximum of about 55,000 of them in 2018. It's dropped a little bit since then. Some of the active ones get closed. And here's the names of the major oil and gas basins. For our study, the one we focused on was the Denver-Julesburg Basin because it was the most active at the time and it produced both oil and gas. But turns out Colorado, at least from an academic's perspective, is a really nice laboratory to investigate these kinds of effects because we also have a dry gas basin over in the Piceance Basin and a couple of coal bed methane basins down in the south. Here's a image, a cartoon of what hydraulic fracturing is like, and it's important to recognize that it has to be combined with horizontal drilling to really work, to really be effective. If you don't get all the details here, one way you can convey this to your friends really well, convey this to your friends really well is this image right here that came from an oil and gas consultant a while back. We're now drilling, like over on the right, with these horizontal wells, and it's like if you're getting the chocolate out of the tiramisu. Back in the old days, we'll say, when we were doing conventional drilling, we'll call this conventional and this unconventional. The conventional drilling was like getting jelly out of a jelly donut. As it turns out, most of the jelly is gone. So we have to go into the formations where the oil and gas was actually formed and use these pretty drastic measures of hydraulic fracturing to get it out. On the surface, it ends up looking like this. And as we know in Colorado, a lot of the places where oil and gas is available in these kinds of formations, it's also getting closer and closer to residential areas. Another way to look at it is to know what's underneath you. Again, the red dots on this map are the oil and gas wells, but the purple and blue and green lines are planned and constructed horizontal wells. And most of them are a couple miles long, okay, just to get an idea of what's going on under the surface out in Weld County in particular. Back in 2010, Josh Fox made a documentary called Gasland. He was a resident of Pennsylvania, but he came out and found a few people in Colorado who could light their tap water on fire in Weld County, which is certainly something nice to put in a documentary to show there's a problem. But for the people who were experiencing this was something that they were really concerned about. Not so much from a health perspective in terms of, when methane comes out of your water, you can have your house blow up. As Kyle started in his talk, he pointed out how the EPA has put some effort into trying to figure out whether or not this is an issue. And here's one of their cartoons explaining what's going on. And I'm going to go through some of the steps here to show you what we investigated. But one thing to start off with was back in 2015, EPA wrote a report that had this conclusion in the draft version. We did not find evidence that these mechanisms had led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resource in the United States. And which all seemed kind of obvious that they weren't going to find widespread systemic impacts because oil and gas is not drilled for everywhere. It would only be where you're drilling for oil and gas. So we started working on this, and let me give you a quick synopsis of some of the things that we, in step one here, where the water came from. In 2010, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission said that, and I'm looking at the 0.08, I'm moving my mouse around it right here, that oil and gas for hydraulic fracturing used only about 0.1% of the water in the state of Colorado. Our colleagues on the team up at Colorado State, led by Takas down here in the corner, did an analysis of water use in Weld County and in Garfield County, the two biggest producing counties. And sure enough, so yeah, you start off here, Colorado, oil and gas used about 0.1%. In Weld County, it was about 1%, this little sliver right here. But if you remember that most agricultural water is really hardwired to agriculture, you can't change that. That 1% is like 10% of the rest of the water, all of this other water for domestic public supply and other uses. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And it was even more so in Garfield County. Again, 0.1% across the whole state where there was oil and gas development and where there wasn't. In Garfield County, it was about 2%, that little sliver there. But again, if you look at it for water that was not used for agriculture, which is the farmers are not going to give it away, that was like 27% of the sort of more discretionary water use. In the chemical mixing side of things, we looked, like Kyle was talking about, we looked at FracFocus. We dug out 4 different states, Colorado, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and Texas, came up with 50,000 frac jobs that we looked at, found 997 unique compounds, and 659 of these were organic that we decided to focus on to see where the hazards were. And we made this graph that take a little bit of time to explain, but basically on the y-axis here, it's how fast the compounds that are used in the frac fluid would break down. And on the x-axis, it's how long it would take these compounds to reach a water well at a typical distance away. And the ones we were really worried about were these ones up in the upper left-hand corner. These are the ones that break down slowly and move fast. These are the ones that would likely actually get to somebody's well. And the ones that have the red and orange dots are the ones we should be concerned about in terms of health effects. So out of those 659 compounds in that upper left corner for the toxic ones, we had 19 compounds that we should really be paying attention to. And interestingly, the city, county of Broomfield took this up in some of their regulations, and COGCC considered it in some of the testimony last year for Senate Bill 181. In the third step here, we got the well injection. And here we focused on the Denver-Julesburg Basin, and we looked at where did methane show up in people's water wells. And this is using all Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission data. We had 924 samples in the DJ Basin where they had methane measurements. 261 of them had concentrations higher than 1 milligram per liter, which is not very high, but that meant that they would send it away to analyze the carbon isotopes in it. And using those carbon isotopes, you could tell that 42 out of the 924 had methane that we would say came from the deep oil and gas formations. And it should not be in people's water wells, but it was 4.5%. That's a pretty high occurrence. And this work was done by Owen Sherwood over in the right-hand corner there. This tied in very closely with where we found some other characteristics that the COGCC would look at for oil and gas wells called high surface casing pressure. Basically like gas trying to get out of the well that wasn't being contained very well. And the places where the high surface casing pressure occurred, these red dots here, matched up quite well with where the thermogenic methane occurred as well. And a lot of the problem was back when they were building oil and gas wells in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the surface casings they put in to protect the aquifers were not very deep. And later in time, people were going deeper and deeper to get water. So the aquifers that they were going to were no longer protected. The occurrence in newer wells has fortunately gone down, but it's still an issue. We looked at BTEX, the acronym or abbreviation for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes in the same area. And this is a paper that we're just getting ready to send in. We had 1,585 samples. And by the way, we looked at BTEX because almost all of the water samples had BTEX measured. It's very commonly measured. And because benzene in particular is a carcinogen that is hazardous at very low concentrations in drinking water. And not just drinking water, but water you use to bathe as well. You can inhale it also. All right, so 51 of these samples out of the 1,585 people had BTEX that showed up in their wells. And out of those, 6 of them were above the MCL, that's the EPA's drinking water limit. So not a lot, but it definitely affects some people. And we're actually expanding this study right now to look at the whole state, see how wide the occurrence was across the whole state. Here's an interesting graph from Mark, that was Mark Schroeder who did this work. We had a time on the x-axis here from 2001 to 2017. And the big blue bars are the number of samples that the oil and gas operators would take per year. And the line you see with the dots is the cumulative number of cases where BTEX showed up in people's wells. And it bumped along for quite a while with, a little under 2 cases per year. But from 2015 to 2017, it was up to like 11 cases per year. And this is concerning. And we're going to extend this study to see what's happened in the last few years as well. Finally, with flowback and produced water, we did a study where we looked at spills. And this was Kit Armstrong's work. And we looked at what may seem like a long time ago now, 2007 to 2014. But that was a good time because it bracketed when unconventional hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling started around 2010 in Colorado. And so it was a good time to see, was there any significant change? Over those 8 years, 1,764 spills, a little less than half of them, reached groundwater, according to the operators. Oops, sorry. Only 3, fortunately, actually had contaminants that reached water wells, as far as we know. Some other data that came out of this one was if you look at how many spills occurred per million barrels of oil and gas produced, over this time period, it dropped from about 9 per million barrels to 6. So that's good. And it also went from 54 to 27% of the spills that actually reach groundwater. So somebody's doing a better job watching out for spills. And 78% of these spills came from tank batteries, where they store either the oil or the produced water. So summing up, back to EPA, they had this thing where they didn't find any evidence that there was widespread systemic impacts. We feel like some of the data that we found, and I was actually on the science advisory board that reviewed the EPA's first draft of this thing. When they came out with their final draft, this is what they wrote. Significant data gaps and uncertainties in available data prevented us from calculating or estimating the national frequency of impacts on drinking water resources. So they totally took back their original finding. And we feel like that doesn't really, it's not really a forceful conclusion in any way, but it was some recognition that the research we did and other people did made a difference. So that's what I've got for today. Thanks for your attention, and I'll hang around as long as anybody has questions.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. There's been, that research was great. There's been a lot of questions about, or chat about benzene in, if, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about what happens when you're exposed to benzene, because I know it's in the air, it's in the water, it comes from fracking. Why is it worrisome?
Yeah, I think with benzene and some other organic compounds, one of the things we pay a lot of attention to is drinking water standards, and we think the only exposure pathway is by drinking it. And there you get into, EPA assumes we drink 2 liters per day of water. But for a lot of these compounds, they don't really like being in water. They would rather volatilize out. So if you're in one of those houses where the water well has been contaminated and you're using that water for your bath water, for your shower water, you're getting a significantly bigger exposure by benzene, as one example of a compound, coming out of that water into the air, and then you're breathing it in. So that inhalation pathway is actually a bigger risk than drinking the water. And it's just another reason why we have to pay attention to what's happening to these water supplies. And as I mentioned, we've got some funding from a new organization called Health Effects Institute. They're based in Boston, actually. And we're continuing this work to go across the rest of the state, see what happened in the rest of the state.
And one more question about the numbers you're using of the spills. That's all industry self-reporting?
Yeah, I see that comment there. Yes, yeah. The way Colorado does it is that the oil and gas operators have to report their spills. And that is a big question, whether or not that's done as well as it should be. They certainly, I think we feel like they don't have a lot of motivation to. I think they do realize, or have come to realize, that if they don't report the spills, it could result in a bigger problem later, and they're starting to want to avoid the bigger problems later. But there's no way to know that for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there might be more questions that pop up in the chat, but I'm gonna keep us moving. Thank you so much, Joe. That was great info. I really appreciate it. And I want to introduce our next 2 speakers. We've got Huma Tariq and Maren Wiltz. They're PhD candidates from the Colorado State University College of Agricultural Sciences and Thomas Borsch Lab. And they're studying, we've been talking a lot about produced water, and they're studying, and we know that produced water gets used in agriculture, and they are studying whether that, the results of that. So they're going to give us some more info. So take it away.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear and see me? Does it look good? Hopefully. Okay.
Yes.
Um,
Thank you.
Cool. So I'm Marin, and today me and Huma are going to talk about the reuse of oil and gas produced water for agricultural irrigation. So to kind of start, produced water is extremely complex and variable. So this map is kind of just showing you at a surface level the different TDS across the country where we see a lot of wells. So where you look kind of Colorado and California, the TDS in comparison to other produced waters is actually relatively low versus when you look more in Pennsylvania, North Dakota kind of areas like that, it is extremely high. And the reason that the composition is so complex is due to different geological formations. So kind of as we've heard earlier, these produced waters are already existing in the earth. So depending on what kind of geologics are happening in those areas, it's going to affect what is in the water. Also, the age of those formations and the wells are going to affect the composition along with the type of hydrocarbons that exist. So overall, it's very difficult to determine the produced water composition as a whole because of how complex it is. A lot of instrumentation is not compatible with kind of the level of complexity that exists in it. And this kind of leads to a lack of analytical methods to properly and confidently identify the composition. And as we kind of heard earlier, a lot of the transformation products right now are unknown. So reactions that can happen within the water between different compounds, that is all kind of on the unknown end at the current moment. So now kind of getting into the agricultural reuse, it could be beneficial, especially because 80% of the produced water is generated in the arid West, where we are experiencing a lot of droughts. So west of the 98th meridian, there's this thing called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Permits, or the NPDES. And basically they can create a set of guidelines, so to speak, where the produced water can be released if it is of good enough quality. So they have a guideline that's if oil and grease, which is a common thing you can determine from a third-party lab, is under 35 milligrams per liter, they can release it out into different kind of like rivers and things like that. So our objective in our lab, or at least one of them, is to conduct a thorough chemical characterization of produced water so we can determine if it can be released for beneficial ag reuse. So some papers that we have done in the past, this one was done by a student, now a PhD doctor, Molly McLaughlin, was assessing the downstream of oil and gas produced water because this water is often then used for reuse in different arid regions. So if we're using this water, but it's downstream of some kind of produced water discharge, it's important to know how those products could be transforming downstream. So some of the things that she found was that concentration of organic chemicals typically decrease downstream. So on the x-axis, you're going to have distance from the discharge site. So in kilometers from 0 to 15, this CS is just the control site. So that's just kind of a normal stream. So obviously that is 0, basically. So you have DROs and GROs. So GROs are gasoline range organics and DROs are diesel range organics, both of which are very common groups of chemicals that are found in produced waters. So you can see that there are elevated concentrations at the site of discharge, not surprisingly, but it does decrease going downstream at a pretty steady rate. And so the gasoline range organics are removed first. They're more volatile, they're more biodegradable. This is kind of our BTEX things. So they're removed relatively quickly. The diesel range organics are typically more persistent. They're less volatile. They are less biodegradable, but they are also decreasing, which is a relatively good sign. We also see that some inorganic chemicals decrease downstream. So looking at chemicals such as strontium or barium. Again, this is a very similar kind of graph showing micrograms per liter and the distance from discharge. Again, it's all kind of starting elevated and some decrease, which could be a good sign. This is of total radium, so the two different isotopes of radium, and you can see that is decreasing over time. But we do see that most inorganic chemicals are actually increasing downstream. So again, it's starting relatively high from the control site, but it is increasing, and this is for TDS, so that's kind of all around inorganic chemicals, signaling that those few that we saw before are actually in the minority, versus now the increase is the common trend. So there is elevated concentration at the discharge site. It does increase downstream, and this is likely due to evaporation. So ephemeral stream beds, having no additional sources of water and being in an arid region is all going to lead to that evaporation, which again concentrates these inorganic chemicals. Not always a great thing. So this is an example of two specific compounds or inorganics that are increasing, both sulfate and boron. Both can be not great for ag. So important to kind of acknowledge that even downstream, we are still seeing kind of elevated levels of this. So the NPDES reporting requirements only pertain to that discharge site. They don't look at downstream changes in water quality, which do need to be considered if we're taking the downstream for different resources and things like ag reuse and things like that. And now Huma will discuss the second objective.
Hi everyone, I'm Huma Tariq. And I'm a third-year PhD student in Thomas Bork Lab at Colorado State University. And I'm going to talk about some of the studies we performed in our lab to determine the impact of produced water irrigation on crop health. Next slide. So produced water has been used for last, I think, 3 decades in California for food crop production. It is mutually beneficial to farmers and oil gas companies, like win-win situation, because we are due to water shortages and all, and it is cheaper than traditional water sources for farmers, and you're not putting that water back into the earth in injection wells. So all the detrimental effects due to that, like earthquakes and all, so you can avoid all of that too. But then important consideration in this scenario is that our crops irrigated with produced water are harmful to human and animal health, detrimental to our environment or not. So these were some of the questions we wanted to address with these projects. So this research was conducted in UC Davis, and our lab was also involved in this, in which they evaluated that the uptake of hydraulic fracturing chemicals if we irrigate water with the produced water. So they simulate the produced water by amending the tap water with selected hydraulic fracturing chemicals and see its impact on crop growth as compared to the plants which were irrigated with the tap water. So they saw that chemicals were found to be taken up at the higher elevated risk levels, both by the plant stems, other tissues, and also the wheat kernels. So wheat was the crop that was used in this experiment. And the crop growth was also stunted, and the yield was also compromised when the plants were irrigated with the water which was embedded with hydraulic fracturing chemicals. So the conclusion from the previous research was that we need to be very careful about the toxicity these chemical caused in the plants, and in turn, whoever consumed those plants, humans or animals. And then there was this other research we conducted here at Colorado State University, where we look at soil health, soil microbiomes, and physiological parameters of the crops like plant height, yield, and all of that chlorophyll content of the plants irrigated with produced water. And that produced water was not 100% pure produced water. It was blended with 95% of the clean tap water. So it was just 5% produced water and 95%. And there were other dilution and treatments too. But in this slide, I'm just going to talk about the 95% tap water and 5% produced water. So what we found was that it decreased soil health, and there was a huge shifts in the microbial communities in the soil, and it also stunted the crop growth and yield and all of that. And it also had impact on crop immune response.
So yeah, that's kind of what we have now. We're still kind of researching, so still many more things to answer. But yeah, these are some of the labs we worked with, some of the EPA members, and then this is our lab at CSU. So
yeah, I and Marin are still doing some experiments, but the results are not published and they're on like just a preliminary stage. So we cannot talk about that, but these are some previous research projects we have conducted in our lab.
Thank you so much. There's some questions in the chat about, has water been cleaned sufficiently for using on agriculture, that sort of thing. Do you guys have some?
So in the projects we conducted, we did not treat the water. That's what we want to see, that if we blend the water with the clean water and use it, but did not treat it in any way.
Okay. So your question is trying to see if produced water is really diluted but not treated, can it be used in crops? And there's still significant impact.
yeah.
There was another question earlier, Marin, when you were asking, I'm trying to, so there were two types of, oh man, I'm looking for it. I'm sorry. I think it was Barb Mills-Bria who asked it. So the minority of the chemicals you were looking at got diluted from the source. What happened to those when they?
Yes. So for organic compounds, a lot of them just volatilize. So kind of similar that was mentioned earlier, they just kind of go up into the atmosphere and, kind of degrade, do their thing. Other ones, they can transform into different products, react with different things, be absorbed by soils, things like that. So there's a lot of different outcomes, but in the water, they no longer are as concentrated.
Gotcha. So they might go up into the air like benzene, go from water to air, that sort of thing. And the other kind of made me think about what Ian was saying at the beginning, how we're a headwater state, and you were saying that they only have to look at what goes into the water at the point source and not downstream.
Yes.
But it seems like we should be also measuring downstream from these wells.
Yeah, definitely. In theory, we for sure should, especially if we're going to be taking from downstream. Yeah, for sure.
Does anybody else have questions for Marin, and who I might have missed some in the chat? Okay. Thank you both so much. It was super interesting. I really appreciate all the research and work you're doing. We're coming right up close to the end of the webinar. I am not seeing our presenter who is going to talk about Suncor. So if you join us in 2 weeks, we'll probably have quite a bit on the water quality around Suncor and their water permit that's coming up. So stay tuned for that next week, and keep an eye on the chat. Feel free to put more questions in there, and I will introduce for our final presenter, Alexis Schwartz. She's a organizer with the Colorado Sierra Club, and she's going to talk to us about this really important bill that we all need to help across the finish line. We have like 1 week left of the legislative session. So, Alexis, are you still here?
Hi, yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, folks. So, wow, I just learned a lot too about how our crops are grown. Alarming stuff. Okay, well, I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see. Can you all see?
Looks good.
All right. Well, wanted to share with you all about some legislation that's moving through the legislature, and it would increase transparency around chemical disclosure in Colorado oil and gas activities. And so this is one piece of policy that would kind of add to the numerous paper cuts and whacks that we can take at the oil and gas industry to weaken it toward greater regulations and make change. And so some of the current problem is that some context. So in March, National Organization of Atmospheric, I think, classified the current drought of the Western US to be the most extensive and intense drought in the 22-year history of the US Drought Monitor. And as some mentioned before me, this is a concern because when these chemicals in water are more concentrated, that's when they have greater health impacts to those who are exposed to it. And so withdrawing water for fracking in times or areas of low water availability, particularly in areas with limited or declining groundwater resources, was found by the EPA to severely impact drinking water resources. Some other detrimental fracking activities include injecting fracking fluids directly into groundwater, discharging inadequately treated wastewater to surface water, and storing wastewater in ways that contaminate groundwater resources. Another detrimental fracking activity is the mixing of fracking fluids and water resources when there's an oil and gas spill or when the fractures of two wells intersect. As current regulations stand, there are hundreds of secret chemicals that are used during oil and gas processes. And this is because Colorado allows generous reporting exemptions for chemicals that operators deem to be proprietary or confidential. And so currently there are reporting requirements, but those regulations protect oil and gas from disclosing those chemicals. They let them kind of keep their secret sauce, their ingredient list, because they say that this is what gives oil and gas operators a competitive edge over their competition. And so the oil and gas industry utilizes those exemptions a lot toward keeping those chemical secrets. Also adding to this issue is that chemical suppliers and well operators who do the reporting aren't always informed of all the ingredients in the products that they sell, purchase, or use. So sometimes too, an actor in the oil and gas industry does not have that information for themselves. And so some recent national reporting and a study by the Physicians for Social Responsibility done this year shows that highly toxic chemicals known as PFAS were used in fracking wells. And PFAS are among the most toxic chemicals detected in drinking water. So PFAS are very toxic, even in low amounts. And they're called the forever chemical because they accumulate in our bodies over time. And 99% of people living in the US are said to have PFAS in our in our blood, in our bodies. So a piece of legislation that's working toward addressing some of these issues, because PFAS in our water, by the way of oil and gas, is a public health issue. And the industry being able to keep what they call trade secrets, it's a risk for public health. And so the legislation moving now, this is House Bill 1348. And I believe the sponsors are Representative Carvalho, Winter, and I always forget the third in a series. I'll come back to this, but this would improve transparency in the use of chemicals by the oil and gas industry. And it does this in several ways. It would require industry to fully disclose chemicals used in all underground oil and gas production activities. So this would result and yield a complete list of chemicals that are used by the oil and gas industry. And so because too, oil and gas industry could say, oh, this is unfair, this is damaging to our competitiveness. This bill would require the disclosure of chemicals, but not the amounts used or the specific mixtures, but it would just require a complete list of chemicals that are used. And so this bill would result in providing detailed reporting for the public, to communities, to people. And this bill would also require chemical suppliers and operators to certify that their chemical mixtures do not contain PFAS. And so this bill would help fill knowledge gaps referred to by some previous presenters by disclosing exactly which chemicals are being used. So this could help direct more targeted water testing in Colorado, because a lot of the chemicals that are known to cause health issues aren't tested for, or some of these chemicals are not allowed to be used, but there's just a gap between those requirements and actual testing that's done. So this bill could result in identifying those chemicals and then kind of paving the way for targeted water testing. All right, and so so we've learned and heard a lot about water issues and oil and gas issues. And so this is a way to take action to move some of these issues forward. And so as Ian referred to, it was the fourth level of government, I believe. So I'd like to share, there's a petition. I'm going to paste the link into the chat. But where the bill is right now is that it will be heard in the Senate Transportation and Environment Committee tomorrow, I believe at 2 p.m. And so signing this petition will generate an email of support that goes to your senator based on the zip code that you provide to encourage your legislator to vote yes tomorrow in its Senate committee. And then I'll share the link in the chat too. If I navigate from the screen, it'll go somewhere else. But then also, if the bill passes a Senate committee, the bill will go to a Senate floor vote. And so fingers crossed, this would probably be later this week. And so if you're interested in organizing a meeting to meet with your legislator, your senator, or calling them and urging their yes vote on the Senate floor vote, please feel free to reach out to me. And I put my email into the slide so that we can follow up with you to share some talking points and some guidance, some tips about calling and or meeting with your senator to urge their yes vote on the Senate floor. And so I'm going to paste now into the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I dropped in the chat as well. This is a super important bill, the 1348. There's also 1345, which is specifically a PFAS ban, that I dropped in the chat as well. We have 1 week left of the legislative session, and we have a bunch of bills that are going to die, like important climate bills that are going to die in committee. I think it's super important for people to email their reps and senators right now and tell them they need to move these climate bills through and get them onto floors for votes, because we're going to lose a lot of important legislation that people worked really hard on if it just dies in committee. So I just want to give that an extra little plug. And one of them is finding out exactly what these chemicals are in oil and gas activity that we've been talking about so much tonight. So I see that people have been, Alexis, did you see people have been dropping their emails in the chat?
Thanks, Kate. Catching up still. Thanks for flagging.
Yeah. So the bill number, I just saw Toby, I put them both in the chat. There's 1348, which Alexis was just talking about, which is transparency in chemicals used in oil and gas activity. And there's 1345, which is specifically a PFAS ban. It's not specific to oil and gas. It's banning PFAS in all sorts of like firefighting foam and those types of things, because PFAS is in a lot of things, not just fracking fluid, but PFAS is included in the oil and gas bill as well. It's those 2 bills that address PFAS in the legislature right now that are being held up and that are being held up and have the potential of dying. So emailing, calling your reps and senators to make sure those and all the important climate bills are moving forward would be really an important action this week. Does anybody else have any questions? Thank you, Alexis, for talking about that bill with us. I really appreciate it. And thank you all. We've been a little long for sticking with us. And I see that Ryan has dropped in the chat the Halt the Harm Network link about this webinar series. So Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about the Halt the Harm? And Doug, I will drop that petition. Let's see. Are you putting the petition in the chat? Awesome. Thank you. Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about the Halt the Harm thing?
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much, Kate. And thanks everyone who presented. It's fantastic. Anyone else here from Halt the Harm? I know there's a few folks here who were here earlier. Lori, Raina, Kevin, a few other people. But feel free to jump in if you'd like, because I'd love to connect and introduce you to other people as well. So I'll share my screen. I've got, can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yep, I can.
Awesome. Okay, great. So Halt the Harm Network is, and this is just a quick 30-second version, is an online network for folks that are working on oil and gas issues. And it's mostly local fights around the country and a number of organizations that work in this space as well. So you can come on in and you can create a profile, and there's actually an entire channel for Colorado water with a bunch of people already in there. And so that's where all of the notes and the video recording will be, but also the upcoming events as well. So you can actually leave comments and check out the upcoming events in this series, and you can stay in touch with all of us and see who else is in the group when you join the Colorado Water channel. What's really cool about Halt the Harm is that we also have this network-wide events calendar. And so anybody can post an event, and then those announcements get shared out to the network. And we also have a monthly call every month, first Thursday. So this week actually is the next call. And the way that the call works is that everybody shows up and they can represent their group or campaign or organization and just share an update. And that's it. It's just a big on stack go around of updates that get put together into notes. So you think about the value of the Zoom chat right here and all the comments and the notes. We're creating that every month, just quick touch points, what's going on. Then there is some breakout discussion for folks who want to stay for that. So please check it out. And if you have any questions, let me know. Those of us that work on the network, we're a small team, and we do a lot of, we just do events like webinars, and we, work with researchers to put together briefing packages, and we have a campaign accelerator coming up. So come check it out. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks so much, Ryan. I really appreciate all your help with getting this webinar together, and just everyone for participating and hanging in there with us. I hope to see everybody next week when we hear from impacted residents and have some more calls to action. So join us next week, and thanks so much. I really appreciate everybody. Thanks to all presenters and all our collaborators.
Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful. Thank you.